Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys about one of the really bizarre myths that are out there in the whole pseudoscience ketogenic world that I was reminded of. Actually, a follower of mine on here, her name's Kate. I saw her post something about it on her wall this morning, and so I'll give her props. I'll give her credit for giving me the idea. But yeah, it's something that all these keto followers or keto advocates talk about, that ketosis is a perfectly natural, healthy state for the body. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And this is something a lot of doctors even say, whoa, you're crazy. It's actually not a normal, healthy state. And they can argue that it is all that they want, but when you look traditionally, there is no society anywhere on earth that goes into ketosis and stays there for any period of time. Historically, anything that we can see, even if you go look at hunter-gatherer societies, you look at the Inuits, because that's kind of your model right there, right? All of these keto followers, they use the Inuits. And we're going to talk about some problems with this in a minute. I'm going to go further into this as far as muscle preservation and everything, of why ketosis is actually really terrible if your goal is body composition. Unless you're using a lot of drugs to hold on to muscle tissue. And, it works really good for people on tons of tren. But a lot of those guys don't even really do a ketogenic diet while claiming they do. Just noting what they eat. But the thing is, you take someone like the Inuits, that's like their model, right? Everyone always uses the Inuits. Well, they follow virtually a ketogenic diet, and it's like they were all slightly heavy. They're not lean when they were in their native diet, and they have a short lifespan. They're one of the shortest living indigenous populations that we can find. Their average life expectancy is dramatically lower than most indigenous peoples that we can find out there. And they have more body fat than all of them. That's your health and weight loss model right there. Alrighty. That's always interesting. But, you take that. Here's the other thing you have to note with the Inuits. Here's how resistant the body is to ketosis. The Inuits have a gene to resist ketosis that other people don't have. Because they follow a relatively low-carb, high-fat diet year-round and have for many generations, they actually have a mutation to resist ketosis. It's very hard for them to go into ketosis compared to other people, because apparently it gave them the higher survival rate to not go into ketosis. Let that sink in. The one population on the face of the earth that follows a diet that might actually put some people, not everybody, into ketosis, because their diet is higher carb than people realize because of a lot of the raw meat and stuff, the glycogen and stuff in there. Turns out their diet isn't like only 5% carbs. It actually is higher than that because of a lot of that. In some cases, as high as like 20% carbohydrates. But low carb, very high fat diet, right? One of the few populations on Earth ever that follow it. They have developed a gene to resist ketosis. Now, when you see a gene develop in a population where an entire group, an entire region, a population has that gene, it's usually because people who didn't have that gene didn't survive very well. Therefore, the ones who had the mutation are the ones that survived and passed it on. In other words, it's possible evidence that long-term ketosis in an entire population would kill them off. That it's not good, it's not healthy, it's not good for longevity. And that's the interesting point. When you start looking at mutations like that, they all have a gene to resist it. Because here's the reality. Fat is not our normal fuel, right? Humans, our preferred fuel source that we burn efficiently and effectively is not fat. We don't burn fat very well. Now, we can burn fat, and if we have extra body fat, yeah, your body will burn through it in a calorie deficit. They'll absolutely do it. But our body's preferred fuel source is carbohydrates. Now, for extreme endurance, fat can work really, really well. And that's one reason we may have started storing fat. One of the many reasons is that for prolonged energy storage, or for endurance activity, we can burn fat just fine. We can't burn it for high-intensity activity, right? We cannot burn it for high-intensity activity. Sprinting, jumping, lifting weights, it's pure sugars, right? If you want to pick something, you're burning sugar basically, and not table sugar, but glucose sugar. That's our body's preferred fuel source. That's what it runs best on. That's what it runs cleanest on. That's what it likes. And if your blood sugar drops too low, you go unconscious, right? You die. You start having tissues die. This is what our body is meant to run on. It will burn fat as a secondary fuel source, but it's not efficient. And the reason that works really well for extreme endurance events is because the stomach and glycogen stores and everything else can only hold so many carbohydrate-based calories. They can only hold so many, and after that, they have to resort over to fat. And so it's hard to keep someone stuffed full of carbohydrates sometimes to run a super marathon, so adding more fat in becomes beneficial for that endurance threshold. And that's totally different. What I would say to most people out there, most of you are not you're not doing enough endurance to where burning fat is a major fuel source from a dietary perspective is going to happen. Now, if you're doing it for fat loss, yeah, you can push through and burn a lot of fat through creating caloric deficit. But that's actually not ideal for an actual endurance sport. Like if you want to run a marathon, you probably don't want to be in a calorie deficit the last 10 miles of the marathon. That is going to impact your performance. So you technically want to eat for it, and so therefore fat loading has its benefits. But outside of that sort of environment, consuming mostly fat or very, very large amounts of fat calories is not really ideal for fueling your body. It really isn't. It's just not. It impedes performance. And here's what it comes down to. Ketogenic diets are terrible for muscle preservation because they're not really high protein diets. Out of all the macronutrients, we know protein is what spares muscle tissue in a caloric deficit. All right? So what I would say to people, and here's the argument always made. A lot of the keto people, and they're right on this, that ultra high protein, lower carb diets don't always work. And because people lose energy quickly and they maybe lose weight too quickly and everything else, that's what they'll argue. They lose performance because they're just not eating enough calories. Well, you're right. You're right. If you cut your carbs to nearly zero and do really high protein instead of high fat, it's actually hard to get enough calories to even be at your proper calorie deficit sometimes. So, maybe you should fill in a little bit extra carbs and fat then. Because most people are not wanting to lose weight that quickly at the expense of feeling terrible. In other words, you don't want to be stuffed on 1,500 calories if you're burning 3,000 a day, right? Probably not good. But to argue that it's not better, yeah, you should be eating more protein than a ketogenic diet if you want to spare muscle. The studies show that you lose muscle on ketogenic diets faster than other diets. They suck at it because not only do you not have the carbohydrates for fuel, you don't have the carbohydrates for fuel, you're having to burn fat, you also don't have an ultra high protein intake to preserve muscle tissue, and which can also be used as a secondary form of glucose by breaking it down. It's just very metabolically expensive. In other words, higher protein, replacing a lot of your carbs with protein, yeah, it can be beneficial for fat loss and muscle retention really well because of the thermic effect and everything involved. It wastes a lot of energy trying to convert it into the sugar that you need. Because your body's going to try to find a way to make it. It'll make it from your muscle tissue if it has to. You guys see the problem there? But it'll also make it from protein that you eat, but it's very metabolically expensive, so that's why it works. So truth be told, all the keto people push all this, you need the really high fat and moderate protein in order to get into ketosis for the appetite suppression and everything else, but it's like, well, your appetite would also be suppressed if you protein loaded all day also. Now, you might be a little more prone to constipation. You're going to need to get more vegetables, other stuff in order to be regular. But if you're going to start reducing carbohydrates, you definitely need to jack protein up. The last thing you want to do is drop protein down if you drop your carbohydrates really low. It's absurd for anyone who's concerned with body composition. And the funny thing is, even some of the strength athletes you meet who promote ketogenic diets, you start looking at what they eat, and they'll say stuff like, well, I get 50% of my calories from protein, and then you're looking and they're on 3,000 calories, or 3,500 calories, or 4,000 calories, with 50% of it protein. So you're talking about these are people who are eating 1,500 to 2,000 calories worth of protein a day and calling it a ketogenic diet. They can assure you they're not in ketosis. Right? They're not in ketosis eating 1,500 or 2,000 calories worth of protein a day. You're not going to be in a ketogenic state doing that. And that's an ultra high protein diet. So there's some confusion there when you do see some strength athletes out there who promote this concept. No, these are people who are eating high fat and high protein. They're eating ultra high protein. If you're eating 400 grams of protein a day or 500 grams of protein a day, you're not on a ketogenic diet. You need to quit saying that you are, because you're giving the wrong impression. And I'm not saying that won't work for someone who doesn't do a lot of endurance work. Maybe someone who does relatively low volumes of training, is for some strength athletes with low reps, maybe high sets with low reps. That's a little bit different, isn't it? They can get away with it because the protein that they're consuming at that sort of rate will replenish their glycogen anyways. And yeah, they might find that very, very efficient for body composition, particularly the ones who are blasting a little bit of gear with it. That can work very, very well. But that's not ketosis. Ketosis, you lose muscle mass when you're in ketosis very quickly. It's not a healthy state. It's not a normal state. It's an inefficient fuel state for your body. And it degrades performance. All right, it hurts your health and it degrades performance. And this whole idea of anyone out there talking about it being a healthy, normal state of the body is absolutely not true. That's absolutely not true. Not based on reality. The closest comparison you have in every day is ketoacidosis, which is, again, a horrific state to be in. It means you're at risk of dying if you're a diabetic. All right, that's the closest thing you see regularly anywhere. You don't see any population on Earth, healthy population on Earth, that sits in ketosis for half the day anywhere. And there's no history of that ever having happened. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.